Story 1. Getting hand-me-down shoes from my brother, who had received them from our older cousin, was my indicator. Those Airwalk shoes were a little worn out by the time I had them. Hand-me-down clothes were my outfits for years. I remember looking at the shirts my brother was wearing and thinking, I can't wait until I get that one. Story 2. Oh, I knew we were poor, but it hit me extra hard that some people don't understand conserving resources when I spent a weekend with a couple of friends. Friend A, who we were staying with, told me I could shower. I said, "Oh, I don't want to waste your water. I can just shower when I get home." She looked at me confused and said, "You aren't wasting water?" Friend B, who was also from a low-income home, explained that I meant I was worried my water usage would increase their water bill and that I was trying to be polite and not be a financial burden on her parents. Turns out they had a well, but also, she had no concept of conserving resources or the financial impact of those resources on her family. That's when I realized there was a world of unburdened choices that some people live in and others do not. She never had to consider the cost of anything at all, whereas I was aware of the cost of every function of my existence. Story 3. I was complaining to my friends in middle school that my nanny was not going to take us to St. Petersburg because my sister got bad grades. They pointed out that normal families do not have nannies, particularly ones from Russia. Another time, our nanny came to parent-teacher conferences since both my parents worked, so she attended all such functions. One of the new teachers was confused about why our very white nanny was smacking us, two very black children, on the head for our conduct in class. When challenged, she told the teacher, "I am not their mom. I work for their mom. They are still my children. I miss her." Story 4. We ate television dinners or canned Chef Boyardee so often that I thought this was just what people ate. When I went to dinner at a friend's house and their mom had prepared a spread, like freshly tossed salad, meat, or even just pasta that was not canned, I instantly realized how hard my mom was working every week to feed us. Story 5. Growing up, my best friend lived in the house just across the alley from mine, so we were back and forth constantly. His family's house had a full second floor with 3 bedrooms and a bathroom. Our house had just 1 room on the second floor. The rest of their house was larger too, but it was really the second floor that made it stand out in my mind. All my cousins had larger houses than ours as well. With the benefit of age, I now realize my parents didn't actually have significantly less money. They were just incredibly frugal and didn't want a very large house. Being much better at managing their money has brought them ahead of most of their friends and siblings who lived a more ostentatious life. Story 6. After my mother remarried, we were probably considered middle class to slightly upper middle class at that time. We were not rich by any means, and my parents were frugal with many things so that we could afford to have fun occasionally. However, the kids I went to school with perceived me as rich when I announced I would not attend high school with them but would attend Catholic school instead. This decision was made by my parents because there were many issues in our small town, and they felt it was better for me to attend Catholic high school to receive a better education and avoid the trouble many students in our town were experiencing. That is not how my classmates took it, and I was called rich girl for being able to attend Catholic high school. Story 7. Our family's lowest point coincided with the Russian economic crisis that followed the fall of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. When friends visited me and saw what was in the fridge, my home was nicknamed the Russian shop by these rather cheeky chaps. That name stayed for quite some time afterward. Story 8. I made the mistake of telling my fellow 5th graders that I lived in a trailer. I was then known as trailer trash. Story 9. When we took in foster children, I was surprised that they received an allowance for back-to-school clothes. My mother and I shopped at yard sales for mine. The next year, when my sister had a job at Sears and took me shopping there for new clothes, it was the first time I ever had brand new clothes for fall. I was 12. Story 10. I received hand-me-down clothes from my cousin, who was very sure to let people know she had worn them first if I was complimented on them. We are 2 years apart. I did not get my first completely new outfit until I was about 12. Unfortunately, she still has a jealousy streak when others either have something she does not have or when she perceives what they have as better than hers. It is very sad considering our respective ages. Story 11. Vacations. We went on international trips when I was little, And that is when I realized how privileged we were compared to the other children in our neighborhood. Story 12. As a kid, I did not really have a clue, but I grew up on base housing. My dad was in the military, so everyone seemed to be pretty even. Once he retired and I went to civilian high school, I met kids who had nicer cars than my parents drove, who had been on vacations all over, and who regularly went skiing. That was when I really started seeing the socioeconomic status differences. Story 13. I lived in a high cost of living area. A schoolmate visited once because we were working on a school project together. He poked fun at the lack of furniture in our house. When I visited his house for the same project, the furnishings were incredible, and the house was immaculately decorated. The difference in our lives was eye-opening. Story 14. The kid across the street had a live-in nanny and housekeeper and was only allowed to play with me and my sister because our dad was a professional engineer, but not with any of our other friends in the neighborhood, whose dads were blue-collar workers. She had all the Barbies, Kens, and accessories. 4 blocks away were the public housing projects, and I rode the bus with those kids. I knew they had less than us, but they still had TVs and were not as badly off as the kids whose mom collected used toys to clean and spruce up as Christmas present donations. I knew one girl who wore the same dress to school every day because it was the only dress she had, and how free lunch was the only food she got most days. Story 15. Went to private school in dollar store canvas gym shoes with rose art crayons. It is difficult when your parents are terrible with money and cheap. There was money to join Amway though. Story 16. Watching my mom skip meals so I could eat. This was after the 2008 financial crisis, losing the house because my dad lost his job, and then my parents got divorced. Edit. That same year, I would regularly go to a friend's house after school by bus, and their mom always cooked food from scratch. We bounced back about 10 years later, though, with a new house in 2019. Story 17. I might have a unique situation where I experienced both homelessness and growing up in the middle class during my childhood. We went from being homeless to middle class, which meant we were in a much better position than about 90% of people around us. The first clue that I was poor was that we didn't have a house. It was difficult because when we finally got a trailer, some of my friends from the wealthier 10% refused to go inside, saying it was gross. And it was objectively so. It was molding, smelled bad, and looked like it was decaying. I felt rejected, and people didn't really want to hang out with me. They definitely pitied me silently. I was homeless and poor because my parents made a huge mistake, and it took years to recover. We were considered poor before the mistake. We received free school lunch and food assistance, but we still had it better than most. Then my parents fixed their situation. My mother's business took off, and suddenly we were living in a large house. Not a mansion, but nice and spacious. After that, people started treating me poorly for being privileged. I think many forgot or didn't know my background, so they treated me like I could never understand their struggles. People were unfriendly toward me and acted superior. It was strange. I felt ostracized in both circumstances. It was a very bizarre experience. Even today, given my job, education, and appearance, people assume I don't know hardship. When I tell them my story, they react strangely, as if they don't believe me. I think they can't admit that someone like me could have had it difficult because it threatens their perspective in some way. Story 18. Parent-teacher association delivering canned food to my house with no warning or advance notice and taking me to buy a pair of shoes. My father scolded me. I was 10 years old and had no way to purchase shoes. I was mortified at school and mistreated at home. Story 19. I casually told my friend how money gets tight the days right before payday and you cannot make major purchases. He did not understand. I said, okay, maybe not that tight. Like, you can eat, just not at a nice place or buy a new part for your car. Still no. His parents make enough money to routinely invest in new things while traveling and buying interesting items. He lives 4 blocks away. Story 20. I was somewhat older than a child when I had that realization. It had not escaped my attention when I was young that I had classmates who lived in nicer neighborhoods and had nicer houses and clothes, but it did not really affect my day-to-day life. I was never teased or bullied for being poor. However, when I reached dating age, it quickly dawned on me that there were young men whose families had enough money to give them substantial allowances to take girls to nice places, while I was working minimum wage jobs over 20 hours a week just to afford to date at all. Again, I was never teased or bullied, though now I strongly suspect that I may have been talked about behind my back by some of the more well-off kids. It definitely restricted the kind of girls I could get to go out with. Story 21. When, after joyfully sharing how rich I felt because we could enjoy the Kohl's holiday sales since we lived below the poverty line, and these were a blessing thanks to my mom's couponing, my aunt looked at me, laughed, and said, "What are you talking about? You are poor." I will never forget that, but I guess I have to thank her to a point. I used that as part of my college essays and ended up getting a full ride. Story 22. Grade school recess snacks. Kids would always have a small bag of chips or a bag of carrots or celery to munch on during recess. I asked my mom to pack me a snack for recess too. I got a box of powdered Jell-O that I would stick my finger into and lick. Kids started offering me their snacks after that, and I realized they pitied me. Story 23. When I went with my dad to pick up the charity Christmas box, I was in kindergarten. I remember thinking it was strange that we would be given a box because charity was for poor people. Then I saw the contents of the box, and my mind was blown by all the wonderful things inside. Looking back, I think it had everything needed for a basic holiday dinner, but I was impressed. I specifically remember that the dinner rolls were incredible. My teacher also gifted me a pair of pink snow pants with little patches that I think she probably sewed on herself. I was enchanted by them and thrilled to have something pink because I always had to wear my brother's hand-me-downs. I was also very excited because it meant I could go outside at recess. It was in Minnesota, so kids weren't allowed to play outside if they weren't dressed appropriately, which was fair but also disappointing for a little kid. I am pretty sure she paid for them herself. I had no clue at the time, but that was very generous. Story 24. How our house smelled. Clean, with good things cooking. How their houses smelled. Like old hot dog water and dust. Story 25. Not understanding why everyone went to Florida instead of Hawaii every year like my family did. I just looked at trying to fly my family of 4 out there and was given a harsh reality check. Story 26. My parents immigrated to the United States before I was born. We never had anything new or any toys that kids at school had, just cheap knockoffs from Asian markets or swap meets. We never saw the new movies when they were released. We waited for everything to come on videotape. We hardly visited any of the scenic locations while growing up in California. I had to visit all of them as an adult. Story 27. I sold eggs to the neighbors for 35 cents a dozen. My mother would fill a gallon milk jug with water and powdered milk and put it back in the refrigerator. My parents would buy wheels of cheese and then cut them into smaller portions to use. My mother would stretch 1 can of chicken noodle soup between 4 children. On road trips, we would stop on the California highway and collect seeds from native plants. Good times. Story 28. Most of everything I had was hand-me-downs. Clothes, toys, books, art supplies, posters. The only time I got new stuff was at the start of school or for Christmas. Even then, start of school clothes were only what you needed, never what you wanted. Payless shoes and Walmart clothes were the original fast fashion. Most kids at our school had 2 or even 3 different coats. I only ever had one, and it was only replaced when it needed to be. If it still fit, I had to continue wearing it. You can imagine the shock when I went to a friend's house and they had a walk-in closet absolutely filled to the brim with clothes, shoes, accessories, toys. Everything. I feel the need to mention that I always had everything I needed, always had warm clothes on my back, and never went unfed. But it was a stark difference from my friends who got all brand new clothes for the start of school every year, brand new boots every winter, brand new summer clothes every year, and just donated their old stuff. Story 29. From the beginning, our mother was honest with us. She told us Santa Claus was not real. She understood that seeing the extravagant gifts other children received might make us feel less special or valued. However, she also asked us to keep that truth to ourselves and not spoil it for others. Story 30. In 1971, the teacher asked each pupil in turn what their father worked at and how much they earned each week. I said my fisherman father had earned £102 last week. She laughed, as did the entire class. My mother ended up going in with his week's payslip to prove I hadn't lied. Apparently, the average weekly take-home pay was £20 in 1971. So, my dad was earning about 5 times that, approximately £3,860 for the week based on today's average wage. I was oblivious to how much more we had. But it was feast and famine. Some weeks he only made £10, others £200. Story 31. People missed extended periods of school because they were on vacation or having a vacation at all. Story 32. Richer. We could afford the actual school uniform and were not receiving free school dinners. Poorer. We did not have anything fancy like the latest game console. The family car was an old beater, and most of our belongings were hand-me-downs. My parents worked incredibly hard. My father did a lot of overtime. We had occasional foreign holidays and eventually a family computer in the late 1990s. Things improved later on as they got better jobs. Story 33. Holes in my winter boots. Living in an apartment. Bringing my lunch while others were eating the daycare lady's food. My mom's car made horrible sounds and had almost systematic breakdowns when she drove me to school. Pancakes for dinner. Story 34. Classmates would hang out at the country club after school and on the weekends, then would go to summer camp in the summer. Story 35. We never owned a car. I never owned any clothes or shoes that were not hand-me-downs or from a thrift shop. We also had government cheese and food stamps. Of course, we never got any kind of fast food or takeout. Story 36. My friend at the time, who constantly talked about being poor, had a lot more possessions than my family and I did. Story 37. I wasn't much better off than my friends. We were just cleaner because running water was important to my mom. My daughter, who is 10 years old, has a friend who is definitely not well off compared to my family and me. We aren't rich, but we get by. I realize this family is scraping pennies because multiple times the friend and her youngest brother have come here and raided the pantry or fridge. I often offer to cook lunch or dinner for all 3 kids. Mac and cheese cups are their favorite, so those don't last long when they are here. It breaks my heart. Story 38. In elementary school, we had a special presentation for the parents, and everyone dressed up in their Sunday best. One friend wore the same clothes she always wore to school. She had no Sunday best. My family did not have a lot, but I knew that she had even less and I felt bad for her. I think I learned empathy that day. Story 39. When I was the poor kid at school, I remember seeing a photo of a birthday party where there was a controller on the floor. I did not recognize it. I asked what it was for. The other kids told me, but also said that the console was bad. I did not realize for years, but it finally struck me later in life that I was poor enough that the middle class and rich kids had access to, and were already bored of, things I did not even know existed. Story 40. I grew up thinking we were poor because my friends always had the latest designer clothes, went on international holidays, and always got takeaway food. Actually, they were all on government assistance, and my financially struggling parents were among the few who worked. Story 41. Other kids didn't have unrelated adult roommates at home. It wasn't like, oh, this is Auntie Claire. It was more like some men who also lived there. On field trips and such, I never had lunch or anything. The idea of even asking for $5 was unimaginable. All of my t-shirts, I only ever had one colored shirt at a time, were 4 sizes too large and came free from conferences where my one parent worked. When I stayed with friends overnight, I was amazed. They had video game systems, sleeping bags, closets full of snacks, and their parents said things like, help yourself. If a show on cable was part of the discussion, I had no idea what anyone was talking about. Story 42. It's funny, but when I grew up, I thought we were pretty rich. I assumed the reason I didn't get name-brand clothing and toys was because they were unnecessary. It never occurred to me that we actually couldn't afford things like that. My parents always made sure we had everything we needed. They always had money for class trips and experiences, and we never went without a good meal. Later, I found out that when we went to the dentist, my mom would pay for the freezing for my sister and me, but when she had dental work, she would go without because it cost money. My mother walked miles to buy food that was on sale at different grocery stores each week. It turns out my parents weren't actually well off. But they sacrificed everything so my sister and I could have our post-secondary schooling paid for and had spare cars we could drive when needed. My parents were exceptional at saving money, and now they are doing very well, although my dad never made that much and my mother never worked. Story 43. I was complaining that I did not get what I wanted for Christmas to a kid at school. When I told him that I received $800, 3 pairs of jeans, 5 shirts, and 4 nice hoodies, he informed me he was lucky to get a single video game and some chocolate. It changed my perspective forever. I was the brattiest of brats. Now I am poor, so that is my fault. Anyway, it is crazy to think that was not enough. Story 44. I remember thinking my friends were wealthier because they got a Nintendo when it first came out. Turns out that does not really mean much. Story 45. I was 6, and my classmate told me that another kid in class said, "Your family is really poor." I remember everyone seemed to have a moment of silence when she said that, as if they understood the weight of the problem. Afterwards, I started noticing the differences between me and the other kids in my class. We were all in the same class for 8 years, and it became painfully obvious. We would go to a store together, and I was the only one without any pocket change. Everyone else had candy while I watched, like some unfortunate little match girl. As a parent, I made sure my son always had money in his pockets. He never had to experience the feeling of being ostracized for something outside of his control. I made mistakes as a parent, but keeping my child impoverished was not one of them. Story 46. All of my family vacations involved driving somewhere and either having a tent in the trunk or later hauling a trailer. The vacations were mostly spent either sitting around or hiking. Even if there was a tourist spot nearby, my parents would not go. I felt like I had won the day my parents agreed to take me to Six Flags. I know some people would say this sounds great, but I just wanted to be like everyone else. Story 47. Everyone was going on holiday to Spain while we were visiting grandfather. Now I cannot even stand the idea of spending a week at the beach. I would die of heat or boredom, I suppose. Story 48. When I went to school, the teachers or the principal would call me to the office and give me clothes because I did not have any. Story 49. Was told cars are for wealthy people as a kid. Showing up at school to a group of kids being dropped off in old, beat-up cars, whom I thought were wealthy. Story 50. My friends and their parents noticed that I never had new clothes and nothing really fit me, so I was getting hand-me-downs from my friends when I stayed the night. Story 51. We went on vacation at least 2 times a year, often 3. Summer vacation was always 3 weeks long. We wore hand-me-downs and second-hand clothes. This was and still is common for German children. My mother was rather poor growing up, and it was important to her to save money and not be wasteful. I am amazed by how some people waste things and money, then complain about not having money. Story 52. I told my friends in 6th grade that Santa had to be real because my parents could not afford the gifts Santa got us. It turns out my parents really loved to spoil us at Christmas and even went into a good amount of debt for it. I am forever grateful, but that was a tough one to argue with my friends about. Story 53. Having recently had children, I have become aware that without social media and similar influences, I do not think I thought about money or my family's lack of it until I was in high school. As a child, I had a very loving grandmother with whom I lived, and life was pretty amazing. I feel sorry for children nowadays. Story 54. All my friends who came to our home talked about us being rich except my genuinely wealthy friend. When I went to my other friends' homes, I was shocked by things like not having a television in every room, snacks and food always available, game and computer systems, and even spending money. My parents always paid for my friends when we did activities. I always had to take my own money and pay for myself when I was with my friends. But when I visited my genuinely wealthy friend, it felt like home. To be fair, we were not always well-to-do. My parents found their stride when I was quite young, and it has been that way since then. I got nice, well-paid, easy jobs as a teenager because of them too, while my other friends had to take jobs like working in fast food. Story 55. I grew up in Michigan, where the summers can be very hot, but only the very wealthy had air conditioning. I remember going to a friend's house whose father was a doctor, and they had the air conditioning running. It was absolutely lovely. Story 56. I was pretty well off and grew up in a nice area of Orange County, California. My best friend when I was a kid lived only about a mile away, but it was a different city. That area is expensive now, but in the 1980s, it was definitely the lesser neighborhood. He lived in a small, rundown duplex raised by his single mother who supported them waitressing. It never occurred to me that he was poor until one day he was very excited that his mother was getting a new car. When my parents got a new car, it was new. Her new car was 20 years old. And that's when it occurred to me that it was new to her and all she could afford. Story 57. Talk of summer vacations, though I never went on any, and hearing what other children received for Christmas. We received basic items we needed. Story 58. My dad was poor, the kind of poor where you had one pair of pants and two shirts in your entire wardrobe. He worked all kinds of odd jobs as a kid to earn any money he could. He had a friend who always wanted to go fishing but didn't have any gear. So my dad gave him a fishing pole. The next time they went out, the kid didn't bring the rod. My dad asked why, and he said, "I can't afford fishing hooks." Story 59. When I was 16 and in high school, the kids were all getting their driver's licenses. The lucky ones started driving to school. Some even got to use a family car or an old car in poor condition. Luckier ones had their parents get them a new car. Then one day, someone drove up in a brand new Aston Martin. Meanwhile, some of us still took the bus all through senior year. Go Wildcats. Story 60. Every meal had large amounts of cheese. We ate grilled cheese sandwiches and macaroni and cheese for months, all from one big box that my mother collected from a government office downtown. Story 61. My first car was a couple of years old Ford Mustang GT. I crashed it a month after getting it while trying to impress a girlfriend. My parents made me trade it in and get an Audi. I don't think that is how 16-year-olds usually get their first cars. Story 62. Until I was in high school, the only winter hats, mittens, and sweaters I had were ones my mother knit. Story 63. I lived in a trailer park and was referred to as being trash. That was a big giveaway. Nobody was really interested in hanging out with me. Whatever. So I hung out by myself, started strength training as a teenager, rode my bicycle down streets and trails, and played video games. Not much has changed since then, except the bicycle part because it gets stolen. So yes, instead of biking, there is a lot of walking. Story 64. I never noticed. Thankfully, my parents handled the finances and let us be kids. We did not know that camping instead of tropical vacations meant we had less money. That was just what our family did. Story 65. Maybe this is a sign of not being poor, but I never thought about how much money my parents had when I was a child. My friends and I all lived similar lives. Story 66. We went on vacations every year, normally out of province. Nowhere crazy Disney once. We never struggled to put food on the table. Never thrift shopped, always had a good car. Never worried about the utilities being cut off. Back-to-school shopping involved me basically buying whatever I wanted for clothing and supplies. Realizing when I got older that, although my mom worked retail, my dad was a vice president at a large company. All that being said, my parents taught me to live within my means, to donate to charities, and generally live by the principle of build a bigger table, not a higher wall. Story 67. We are not poor, but my 6-year-old has been asking me for years why we only have one house since most of his friends have several. Story 68. This is not a sob story, and I am not looking for pity. My answer is interesting because of how I discovered that I was the poorest in a rich family. It is all comparative. We are not poor whatsoever. I have 4 siblings, so hand-me-downs were pretty standard. Then my friends started going on trips and cruises around the world, and we went to Big Bear. I am not complaining. It is comparative. Then my friends would be going VIP to Coachella. I had to buy those tickets with my own money. So it is the small things. Story 69. I was not poor, but I ended up in a high school with many wealthy students. Most of them did not consider themselves well off because they were upper middle class, not truly wealthy. Some shared stories about their home lives that I thought were jokes, as if they were using exaggeration to make light of the small amount of excess they actually had. I did not fully understand until we were applying to colleges. I had friends who did not complete the free application for federal student aid because their annual household income exceeded the form's limits. These students had difficulties. Their lives were not perfect. However, they did not face problems that money could buy. Story 70. Donated food and clothes. I did not get to pick my own clothes until high school, and only a few items because they were on clearance at an outlet mall. Story 71. Walked into a friend's house, and his sister was eating a peeled onion like an apple. They were poorer than we were. Story 72. I was occasionally the only child who did not have $5 to go on a school field trip. Most teachers would make me stay back with a book. One teacher was really great and paid for my $5 movie ticket and even got me a slice of pizza for lunch. Story 73. Going to friends' houses as a child and seeing home decor and bedroom sets. I always wanted a mattress that was not on the floor, but I guess when you move every year it is not practical. Story 74. My first time spending the weekend at my cousin's house. All their food was name brand, and all of their appliances were modern. They had satellite television with a large dish in the corner of the backyard. I was watching channels I had never heard of before, and they had the unlocked package, so they received every channel. Going back home was very depressing. Story 75. I remember asking a child what happened at Armani Exchange when he was wearing that brand of shirt. I thought it was a historical event because I had never really seen branded clothing like that before. I remember getting a big bag of clothes every year from my cousins and going through them to see what fit and what I was not allowed to have. I remember being upset that I could not have a South Park shirt and a Rob Zombie shirt as a first grader. Story 76. When I was the only kid at school without a phone. Not a personal cell phone but a home phone. I took advantage of it once when a teacher threatened to call my parents, and I told her, "Go ahead and try. We don't have a phone." Story 77. The fact that we spent 2 years living in a 24 by 48-foot pole barn with partial dirt floors was a clear indication. Story 78. I was fairly well off in a town full of people who mostly lived below the poverty line. We took a 2-week vacation every summer. By my senior year, I had been to almost all United States states. One kid asked me one time if I went on vacation this summer, and I told him we went to Hawaii. He had never been outside town limits. Story 79. Going to private school with classmates whose families owned well-known businesses or hockey teams. Story 80. What do you mean you have never been on vacation? According to the look on my classmate's face, I just said something completely absurd. Story 81. The size of our family and its general setup told me from a young age that I was part of something most other people do not have or experience. Story 82. One of my neighbor's houses caught fire. It was a total loss. Everything went up in smoke. They received donations of clothes and other items. After they finished selecting what they wanted, they brought the remaining items to us. I am so poor that the people who lost their house and livelihood gave us their things. Story 83. Unemployment affected our family several times during the car industry decline in the 1970s and 1980s. Free school meal vouchers made it a stigma. Story 84. Never having new clothing or new shoes. My siblings and I got our clothing from a charity clothing bank until we were teenagers. I guess it would not have been so bad if the clothing was somewhat fashionable. But the charity received clothing from elderly people who had passed away, and their families donated it. My mother was dressing us in the late 1970s and early 1980s in clothing that was new and in style sometime in the 1940s. Story 85. We did not have a water and ice cube dispenser with extra points for crushing capabilities on our refrigerator. Story 86. Well, my family was well-to-do. In my country, it is common to have nannies, so I had one nanny and lived in an apartment, whereas my friends lived in mansions and had at least 3. Story 87. I realized that my friends' families were wealthier when I went to a friend's house, and they had multiple acres of land with an all-terrain vehicle course through it, complete with 6 all-terrain vehicles. We were definitely not poor, but we were not that rich. Story 88. I remember being made fun of on the bus because my house did not have siding. It had some siding, but it was mostly just the foam. Story 89. Hand-me-down clothes, boxed and canned meals. Lived in a house made for a family of 4 despite being a family of 7. There were people much worse off than us, so I never thought of us as poor. Parents made life feel normal, so it wasn't until my late teens or early 20s that I realized we were actually poor growing up. I don't look back at it negatively, though. I was taught the proper things to value in life. Story 90. I went to a costly summer camp, which I did not realize was expensive until I tried to get my friend to go with me and her parents could not afford it. Story 91. When the tooth fairy came to my house, I got $1 and a pack of gum. When she went to my friend's house, she got $20 and a Beanie Baby. Story 92. I did not step foot in a Walmart until college. None of my friends growing up understood when I said, "Oh, my mom will not let us go to Walmart because it is gross." Story 93. I always thought that when you needed a change in your house, you hired people to either remodel a space or build you an additional room. My parents did this several times when I was growing up, and so did many of my neighbors. I didn't think I lived in a big house because to me it was just a regular house with several additions. Until I was driven home by a new friend's mother, and when she turned down my street, she kept saying, "Oh my God, look at that one." When they pulled up to my house, both my friend and her mother were awestruck. I remember feeling really embarrassed and trying to explain that it wasn't actually big, but that just made me sound foolish. Story 94. We had a house, they had a trailer. Not that it was a huge impressive house or anything, but it did not have wheels. Story 95. I received everything hand-me-down from my older sibling, often the cheapest variant, sometimes with tears in the boots where my foot was slightly visible. It turned out we were far wealthier than everyone else combined. My dad just reinvested most of the profits, spending about 0.5% of his net worth per year, sometimes less. Story 96. It took me a while to realize it, but hand-me-down clothes, including Fruit of the Loom Tidy Whities, and a free lunch card were part of my life from as early as I could remember. Story 97. We did not have a house, recreational vehicle, boat, or motorcycles. My family owned one very old used car. Many of my friends had all those things and more. Story 98. My older sibling received all the new and nice items, including food, while I ate leftovers and wore the same clothes, including a jacket, year-round. Story 99. In the 6th grade, a girl in my class cried because a group of girls made fun of her jeans. Fashion was not something I was interested in at the time, but apparently, I had the right jeans. I went home, used my grandmother's seam ripper, and took the triangles off of 3 pockets to give to her. I was not the kid to ask for expensive things, but I realized that I had never really wanted anything that did not materialize, and that was not the same for everyone. Story 100. Not being able to pay $1 for popcorn and soda every Friday, or $1 for the sports games at the end of the year, or $1 for bottled water on field day, while the other kids usually could. Also getting in trouble for having frayed jeans and my parents worrying because they couldn't afford to buy us new ones. Story 101. Even though I am sure our household income was less than my friends' parents, I never felt poor and actually felt a little better than them in a way. It is totally ridiculous, but even though they had more expensive cars, clothes, pools, and vacations, my parents were cooler, better looking, had better taste in things and style, were more interesting and nicer, and kinder to neighbors and pets. People loved them. I really never envied anyone then and thought they were unpleasant. Story 102. All the snacks we brought to school came from Aldi, meaning I was the only kid without name-brand lunch snacks. Story 103. At the start of the school year, the teacher asked, "Where did you go on vacation this summer?" I was the only one who did not go anywhere. Story 104. My cousins had a large entertainment center with almost every Disney movie on videocassette. We had The Little Mermaid on videocassette, and that was about it. Story 105. I feel like this belongs here. We are all still poor. Story 106. My cousin had absolutely loads of action men, also known as G.I. Joe. I had one. That kid from school had all the Thunderbirds vehicles, the really big ones. I had Thunderbird 4 from a cereal packet. Story 107. We made our own slip and slide using a plastic tarp and the water hose, while my friend who lived 2 houses away had a real slip and slide and eventually got a huge in-ground pool. Story 108. Hand-me-downs, school shopping only at thrift stores. Never getting anything new unless it was from Walmart. Suave shampoo. Story 109. I have been on both sides. When I was young, I was always annoyed that we had to drive across the country to our vacation spot instead of flying like my neighbors did. About 7 families vacationed together, and we were the only ones who drove. Later, I brought a school friend home, and they were in awe of the size of our house. To me, it was a normal size. Eventually, I realized we were the poor kids in our neighborhood, but we were not actually poor. Story 110. Both my parents were alive and present. One had a job and we went on holidays. These were clear indications that we did better than most other children in the neighborhood I grew up in. Story 111. First plane ride at age 12, no other flights until age 15, then none again until adulthood. My mother worked multiple jobs to pay for those 2 holidays. Story 112. Other kids did not have country clubs they spent time at, let alone 3. For my one friend who follows me and will probably see this, when you described one of them as not a real country club, because it is just a private community lot with a pool and tennis courts, people see you as spoiled for making a distinction no matter how true it is. Story 113. When the kid up the road invited you for a lunch of actual name-brand potted meat and you got excited. It was the 1970s. We were all broke, but potted meat versus that bologna sandwich was amazing. Ironically, it was the same meat just in a different form. Story 114. We were in the lower end of the middle class, but my best friend was very poor. She basically lived at our house and got so excited that we had name-brand cereal she would pour them all together in a big bowl. On the other hand, my other friend used to regularly steal money from her parents' wallet without them noticing, like 20-pound notes. My mum would have noticed if I had taken a penny because we needed it. Story 115. Netto shopper. UK here. We shopped at Netto. A Netto grocery bag was obvious on the playground. Every crisp and biscuit packet had a yellow rectangle with bold black Netto written on it. Couldn't hide it. Also, hand-me-downs from brothers. I'm a girl. I have 2 older brothers and 1 younger. I got the old school jumper the eldest had after the second. When the second eldest brother started school, they had redone the school logo, but he still had the old one. He was obviously teased. Imagine how it was for me with a double old logo. Some teachers even commented that they didn't know what the old logo looked like. The old or original logo was just letters like SEMS, and that was it on the jumper. The new logo was a big swan with a golden ring around it, and with Swan East Middle School written around the image. So it was very noticeable. The second brother was a full-on sleeve chewer, so by the time I got the jumper, it was barely gray instead of blue, too big and stretched, and the sleeves were just gross. Yes, I looked very poor. Story 116. The food all my friends had, freely sharing and giving away snacks. The seasonal new outfits, such as for Easter, summer, and school. Their parents driving them to various places. Story 117. Not my memory, but my mother told me about the time one of my kindergarten friends' mothers came over to our house and burst into tears. My mother just awkwardly stood there, as we are not an emotional people, and consoled her as she left. She told me this years later. She grew up really poor and succeeded. Anyway, we lost it all about 5 years later and never really bounced back. But it comes and goes. Story 118. When my dad worked weighing trucks, he would bring home dead chickens when a truck was overweight. We had to pluck the feathers before we could eat them. We also ate fresh vegetables from the garden. All my friends' food came in packages from the grocery store. Also, my friends' houses had air conditioning. Story 119. I remember my friend complaining about allowance and asking me about mine. I had to explain how my father took the money from my lawn mowing business. Story 120. We were not poor, but we definitely did not have much money. The thing is that I had no idea when I was growing up. We always had a roof over our heads and enough to eat. It was not until fairly recently that my father and I talked about it. Story 121. Everyone else had our school logo embroidered on their uniform polo shirt, but we had patches with the logo sewn onto inexpensive polo shirts. Story 122. When I was 8, we moved from a small suburban neighborhood to a lake house in the country. Our new house was much nicer and bigger than all the others nearby. My parents always bought new cars every 3 to 5 years, while most other people drove older cars. In the previous neighborhood, Everyone seemed to be on the same level of wealth, but I learned that my parents were just hiding theirs. Story 123. The only vacations were to see family, usually when someone was sick or had passed away. All my clothes came from Goodwill. Story 124. My classmates went trick-or-treating at Bill Gates's house and received $20 from the Tooth Fairy. I went trick-or-treating in the neighborhood where I actually lived and received $1 from the Tooth Fairy. Story 125. When we landed in Monaco, actually nice to meet a friend, their father had a Falcon 8X jet. It was much bigger than our little Citation. I was so embarrassed I couldn't look them in the eye. Story 126. I was invited to my new friends' houses and realized I could never have them over at mine without feeling immensely guilty. I thought it was a luxury that they ate supper around the television instead of the boring family dinners I had in our dining room. When I finally managed to invite them over for a big birthday party sleepover, I interrupted every compliment about how nice my house was by saying what my parents had told me, which was that it is way cheaper to build a big house on farm yards instead of town lots. Maybe in terms of lot price, but the materials cost the same. My parents built our house after becoming financially successful independently. I feel incredibly lucky for my privileged upbringing. My dad turned a failing farm into a reasonably successful one, and my mom made smart investments while working double time in various administrative roles. Once my mom asked me if I was embarrassed by how nice our house was compared to the trailers my friends lived in. I lied, but she knew. Story 127. I was the first child to get gaming consoles compared to every other child, from Atari to PlayStation. Not everyone even had one. I think only 4 or 5 children were lucky enough to have a gaming console, and I was always the first to get the latest. Story 128. When my friends had air conditioning, we had box fans. When my friends had single-serve ice cream cups from Schwann's, we had ice cream in a gallon pail. When my friends always had popsicles or freeze pops in the freezer, we never did. If my friends were cold, they turned up the thermostat, and I put on more clothes or an extra blanket. Their parents would give them a ride to a friend's house or school, and I had to walk everywhere. Story 129. When everyone talked about the trips they took for summer vacation or getting brand name clothes for back to school. Story 130. I was at my cousin's home with her friend, and I offered to make something, but it turned out they had no glue, no plasticine, no paints, and no sewing threads. It blew my mind. Story 131. I used to get up in the morning at 10:30, half an hour before I went to bed. I ate a lump of freezing cold poison, worked 28 hours a day at the mill, and paid the mill owner to let us work there. When I went home, our dad used to murder us in cold blood each night and dance on our graves, singing hallelujah. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.